Welcome to Be With Champions. I'm your host, Greg Bennett. And in today's episode, I have a wonderful conversation with Joel Filliol, one of the all-time greatest endurance coaches. And what I loved about this chat was just how open and forthcoming Joel was with his wealth of knowledge that he's built over the last 20 years. And the big takeaway for me was just how simple his approach is, and what that approach is just the minimal effective dose of training for any given athlete. So it's not about volume, it's not about data. He's actually looking at it from what is the minimal effective dose of training that an athlete can do to perform consistently and frequently and perform on the world stage on any specific race day. And if you're an athlete or a coach, this is a must listen. And even if you're not, just the message in this episode is to unclutter your life and simplify and do the basics well. I want to thank everybody for all your feedback. It's been really valuable, whether you're giving me feedback on the app with reviews or via social media. On the social media, I'll try and get back to all of you guys. On the apps, they don't let me get back to you or respond to your reviews, so I apologize for that. But if you want me to get back to you, and then come to my social media platforms. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe it and share it. You'd be doing me a huge favor with that. And thanks for listening, everybody. I really enjoyed this chat with Joel, so I hope you do as well. Before we start, I've got to give a quick shout out to my friends at Athletic Greens that help make this show possible. I love this company and I love their all-in-one daily drink. It's become a part of my morning routine. You see, when I retired from professional sport, I thought, oh, great, I won't have to worry about any more injuries and sickness would be a thing of the past. But as it would happen, I felt like my immune system decided to retire as well. So I was looking for something that was easy to use and that would support my immunity, boost my energy, and just help with my recovery and my gut health. And I found that with Athletic Greens. And honestly, I can't believe a green drink sourced from whole foods can actually taste so good. Personally, I love it. And there's no hassle. It's delivered straight to your door, and it's a highly absorbable powder that takes seconds to mix with water. So there's no clumpiness to deal with. It's developed from a complex blend of 75 vitamins and minerals. It's packed with adaptogens for recovery, probiotics and digestive enzymes for gut health, and vitamin C and zinc nitrate for immune support. So Athletic Greens is designed to help fill the nutritional gaps in your diet. Look, even with a balanced diet, it's difficult to cover all your nutritional needs, but that's where Athletic Greens can really help. Their daily drink is like a nutritional insurance for your body. It's NSF certified for sport, and there's no harmful chemicals, no GMOs, no funny additives. Honestly, I can't recommend Athletic Greens enough. Whether you're looking to boost your energy levels, support your immune system, or address your gut health, now's a perfect time to try Athletic Greens for yourself. There's a great offer going on now for you to give a try. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Greg to claim our special offer of 20 free daily travel packs with your first purchase. That's a $79 added value. And Athletic Greens is delivered straight to your door. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Greg. I want to also give a huge shout out to my mushroom buddies at Four Sigmatic that are just tremendous supporters of this show, and an incredible wellness company that's mixing shrooms and adaptogens with coffee, cocoa, latte, protein powder, and even edible skincare products. Personally, I've been using Four Sigmatic for years, and one of my staples is the mushroom coffee with the lion's mane instead of just regular coffee. And wow, I just love how much more productive and creative and clear thinking I am. And I don't get the jitters or the midday crash. Plus, it includes chaga, which is the king of all the mushrooms. Right now, chaga is my favorite functional mushroom. The compounds and antioxidant properties of chaga just play such a huge role in supporting our immune system and maintaining its function. And you're probably thinking, does this coffee taste like mushrooms? And I can guarantee you it tastes just like regular coffee and not like mushrooms at all. And even the lion's mane elixir, which I take regularly on its own, is sweet and smooth. And best of all, Four Sigmatic stands behind all their products unconditionally with a 100% money-back guarantee. So love every sip or just get your money back. And of course, we have a special offer for you, the Be With Champions listener. Receive 15% off your Four Sigmatic order. Just go to foursigmatic.com/Greg or enter code Greg at checkout. That is FOURSIGMATIC.com/Greg to receive 15% off your order. All right, today's guest is one of the most successful endurance coaches on the planet, producing Olympic medalists and world champions consistently in both the men's and the women's categories. I've had several of his athletes on Be With Champions, including Simon Whitfield, Mario Mola, and Vincent Luis, and all sang his praises and praised the incredible team culture that he's created. And I've been eager to get him on the show to just get a better sense of the why, the how, the what of his training culture. And he's been a good mate of mine for almost 20 years, and I've watched him develop to one of the all-time great coaches, and I'm delighted to have him on this show. So welcome, and thanks for joining me on Be With Champions, Mr. Joel Filliol. How are you, mate?
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and really look forward to speaking with you tonight.
Yeah. Where are you at the moment in your lockdown part of the world?
Yeah, so I live in Glasgow in Scotland, so I'm at home.
All right. And you got the couple of kids and everything, so you're getting plenty of parenting time, I bet, right now.
Yeah, this is the longest time I'll have been at home for maybe a decade, depending, obviously different homes, but still a long time.
I know, because I think, when I've had both Mario and Vincent, said, look, we're on the road sort of 200 plus days a year. I mean, you're with the athletes that entire time, the training squad, aren't you?
We spend a long period of training camps together. Typically, that starts in December and runs through to the first World Series. So usually that's in March, and then we regroup where the schedule demands. But typically, between December and September, we spend a lot of time together. It's not a residential squad, so it's a squad that moves according to the needs and the calendar, as opposed to living in one place like back in the day in Victoria or other places like Leeds or places around the world where the athletes live full time in that place. So we move according to what makes sense for us.
And are you able to travel with the family for a lot of that?
Sometimes it's difficult to combine both, and I didn't choose Glasgow here because it was great for training, but for family. So, although I have to say the training is quite good, but perhaps the weather and really the location isn't our first choice. So we often are in Spain. Sometimes in France, or we were supposed to be in Florida this year, but obviously that got changed. But we move around, but not so much with the family. So that's been the challenge for me to balance that over the last years.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was going to have you on the show probably a couple of months ago, almost now, right when this all sort of was happening, and you're like, hang on, Greg, I've got to get back to Scotland and get settled again. I think you even made it over to Florida, didn't you, for a little bit, and then you kind of had to get back? Or
no, I didn't even make it on the flight. The athletes had gone over just right around the time that the US was stopping flights from Europe, and at the time it was still okay from the UK, but then when it came time for me to travel, it was too late.
And so how are you with the athletes now? Most of the athletes you've had in your squad for quite some time, and so I think they have a pretty good feel of the routine and that kind of thing. And how have you dialed back, or how are you managing their training now from a distance, and the kind of training that you're giving them?
At first, it was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know, whether we were potentially training for races still in May, or if then the I2 decided they would stop things up until the end of June, and then we still weren't sure. But it's got a bit easier now that we know that the season has been really postponed, at least to the European autumn. So there's not a precedent for this, though, and I've thought about what's the right way to handle this, and it's not something that you can draw on experience. It's not like a normal off season without races. The athletes still want to do some training, but how do we manage that without clear goals? So I think I've been trying to treat it differently for everybody and trying to understand, well, what's going to allow the athlete to get through this period? What do they need to do? Do they need to be kind of in a maintenance phase, kind of keep a stable level of training that they can manage, but gives us room to build up from there. Some others have gone after some goals, whether that be some long rides. The e-racing has been something interesting for some athletes. So it really has been individual, but I've tried to give everybody space to kind of process it in their own way. All of these athletes were building up and totally focused on Tokyo, and then just to have that stop. And we've all been on this process for many years, and to have that goal be postponed has been a real adjustment. And when I think about again, how does everybody handle that individually? What do they need to do? Did they need to back off for a little bit, take a rest and regroup, or some push on with some short-term goals? But I think the answer ultimately has been individually thinking about knowing the athlete and finding the best individual plan for them. Just recently, we started to see some dates perhaps pop up for the autumn again, and that's going to help a lot to have some goals to focus on.
It was funny. The first thing I said to Laura, who you know as well, and when all of this happened, was just as ex-athletes, we could just sense the almost a deflated feeling that would have occurred with the whole year and the Olympic focus. And don't get me wrong, I'm not cheapening what's truly happening to many other people out there, but in terms of Olympic athletes and the mindset that you've had and the all-in kind of mindset that you've had for many, many years to get to this one goal, and then to have it at the moment just postponed, which is good that it's just postponed, but you're kind of in that final, you're getting ready for that final push in kind of in that April, May, June, getting ready for sort of a July, August Olympics. And suddenly it's like you said, whoa, I've never been here before. How do I deal with this? And how much of it has been managing some of the emotions with the athletes, or have they all kind of just taken it on and themselves?
I think everyone's different. I think some probably needed some time to process it, and so I thought the best to give them some space to do that, and want to communicate but not over communicate. And because there hasn't been really a lot of news up until recently. We were just waiting, and that uncertainty, it certainly has some mental overhead that of like, well, we're waiting, we don't know, we can talk about it, but we kind of end up spinning our wheels, speculating and spending a bunch of energy. So yeah, I think again, everyone is different. I think some, even personally, like myself, I feel like we've been on the high performance treadmill, the same routine year after year of clear goals, what we're doing, as you say, all in, and that makes the quite painful to sort of stop in that sense and have to deal with a totally different pattern and figure a way through that. So I've felt that personally, and I think people have handled it in different ways. I think as we're coming out of this first phase of being able to move again, train again, depending where they've been, I think people are starting to reflect, and some athletes reflecting how there's been a positive side to this, which is, finding time to appreciate that process, and when you're in the thick of it, it can kind of, disappear, that everyday process. You don't think about it very much. It's hard, but it's enjoyable. It can sometimes feel, can you ask yourself, can you keep doing it? Can you sustain this? And so this pause, this external pause, I think has caused some reflections in a number of athletes that I've talked to, and you think, well, we have to find the silver lining here, and the silver lining is that that refinding that joy and appreciation for what it is we do, and how fortunate we're able to pursue sport in a focused and serious way, and looking forward to the gradual resumption of that. I mean, what the new normal is, we'll see. It may take some time, but just having goals again, I think will help us all get pointed in the right direction.
That's really well said, and I've kind of said it on this show a couple of times that there have been some positives, takeaways from this, and whether that's spending more time with family, or it's working on our own individual health and immunity and all these kinds of things, and or if it's like you said, just being present and being appreciative and having tremendous gratitude for the life that we did have or were having, and having that chance to reflect, I think is that really is a positive thing, because that treadmill that you jump on, pardon the pun, but that treadmill of life that we all get on, we're full steam ahead, and especially as athletes, you put the blinders on to the rest of the world to some degree. You have to, and you just go, right, this is what I'm doing, and on one track, and then boom, you've been ripped out of it. And I think you put it right. It's like when we're talking about well, you've got two little kids, so you'd know the book "Oh, the Places You Go" with Dr. Seuss. It's one of my favorite all-time books. It's like one of the first self-help books for kids. But there's a point in that book where basically, the book, for people that don't know, it talks about how you're going to be flying and you're going to be beating everybody, and then you're going to come crashing down, and you're going to be in a slump, and unslumping yourself is really hard to do. But then you're going to be stuck in this waiting room, and waiting is like the worst place. It's like, I'm just stuck in this waiting room, and people are waiting for a train or waiting for, it's a very rhyming book, and it's a lot of fun. But the point of that whole book, and what you were just saying, this being consumed of just sitting in the waiting and the not knowing, is very uneasy, and you kind of, it's frustrating to some degree. So I get what you're saying. There's a little bit of like, okay, there's light at the end of the tunnel for all of us, and that is exciting, going forward. But I just want to wind the clock a little bit back. And well, even before I do that, I really want to look at just 2019 and give you a bit of a pat on the back for people that don't know. And I'm going to be slightly off this, so you can correct me. But 2019, you had both the men's and the women's world champions with Katie Safaris and Vincent Luis in the men. And then you had, I think it was 19 podiums with about 12 wins with varying athletes. And then I think Mario as well was on the podium of the World Series as well. That was a pretty outstanding year from one squad, one coach. Has that ever been done before to quite that degree?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think you're more or less right. We had 7 different athletes win 12 races, 12 World Series. 7 different athletes of 4 women and 3 men. And I mean, I guess they tend not to think about it too much, because we're just in the moment, doing our thing, and the athletes are going out there and racing. But it's nice to reflect a little bit, and we have had more time now to think about it a little bit. But I guess it's built up to that over time. So it's not it wasn't kind of, each one wasn't sort of surprising. We take one, each part of the process, each race, each build up, as its own thing. But certainly, really fortunate to have been along this journey with these athletes and being part of that success. And obviously really fortunate that I'm able to work with all of these very talented and driven athletes, and athletes who could commit to the same vision together, and be part of that process together, and even compete together. As you said, Mario on the podium, and his training mate Vince takes the world title that he had held for the previous 3 years, but being part of that process together, and appreciating that, training with some of your biggest competitors. I think, really, when I reflect on that part of it, how we've been able to compete together, but also enjoy that process together, help each other get better, then, that's the part that I take the most joy from, is reflecting on that part of it. The outcomes are great, but, how did we get to that and build that environment up where athletes wanted to be part of it? They chose to be part of it. And, we've been building over a number of years, but, to have that kind of success is fantastic. And, well, in the moment, as I say, I don't tend to think about it too much, but, over time, certainly, really pleased to have those opportunities, up into 2019.
Look, I think there's a number of reasons I wanted you on the show. Obviously, I want to dive into a bit of your training philosophies and everything else, but probably the number one reason I wanted you on was after my conversations, specifically with Mario and Vincent, and to some degree Simon Whitfield, but he's probably 2008 is when he got the silver medal with you at the Olympic Games. But more recently, Mario and Vincent, and I probably spent a good third of each episode with both of them talking about you and the squad. And so what fascinated me was, I've been in a number of squads, and I found them quite challenging as an athlete with a reasonably big chip on his shoulder and a bit of an ego and wanting to race everybody and prove myself all the time, or maybe you just call it insecurities. I don't know what it is, but you've been able to create this team culture where, I mean, Mario, we both know, is probably one of the most likable people on the planet and one of the nicest souls you could ever meet. Vincent Luis was just, I got to know him a little bit more on the podcast. And for those that haven't listened to my show, that's a great one to go listen to, because just an inspirational story and tremendous character in his own right. But they both talked about how they never had that sense of real ego. I mean, Vincent said when he first joined you, maybe there was a little bit, he felt like he had to kind of prove that he's meant to belong, and then he got his ass handed to him by everybody. But both of them sort of talked about this team culture. Is that something that you are aware of and are creating, or is it something that you've just been fortunate to have athletes with the right personalities and the right mix?
I think it's a bit of both. I think from when we started, I guess the current iteration of this squad started in after the London Olympics, just after that, and Mario was one of the first athletes that joined, and Vince came quite a bit later, but so in part it's who the athletes were, and honestly, a bit of luck of the right kind of personalities. But of course, you tend to attract and build relationships with people that you can find the same wavelength. So that's been part of it. So a bit, can't deny the being at the right place at the right time, but also what we reinforce. And I think our culture is one where we try to reinforce and the way that we operate is about self-discipline, and it's about autonomy. It's about working together, but also doing the right thing individually. And we don't value or emphasize the quality of our training from how fast we're going and pushing each other. So it's kind of perhaps the opposite that somebody might think at the beginning. All these guys, are they pushing each other? Is the reason that they're winning because they're making each other go faster in training? And actually, I don't think that's not our goal. And we certainly we always try to be keeping things under control. And it's not about going faster, but it's kind of more supporting each other through the everyday process. And I think it being together makes it easier to do the level of work required. And that process day after day after day, there's always somebody on a slightly better day that pulls you up, and other days where you're full of energy and you might pull somebody else up. But it's not about pushing each other to go faster. So that's where perhaps we've been a bit different, and that's been part of how we've been able to, I think, have sustainable success. We think about what's the right amount of work, the right amount of quality, the speeds that we need to go to get the right response, and not necessarily always going faster. So there's been that part of, we don't have a competitive culture in that way. Of course, I mean, everyone has their own confidence and their own insecurities. And I suppose if we can have the kind of environment where, it's okay to have a bad day. And in fact, we'd probably encourage athletes to shut it down if they're struggling, or if they're not on that day, not to just push through just because their training mates are, but know that they'll have another day. And that idea that you should never do today what will compromise what you plan to do tomorrow. So if going too fast today is gonna negatively impact you tomorrow, then we try to avoid those situations. So within that wider culture, I think that's partly why we don't have the feeling of a lot of competitiveness. I think we try to have high standards. We try to challenge each other in different ways. But underpinning all of that is that individual responsibility to do the right thing for them, and that we don't reward, or I try not to reward, but this then the athletes will do it themselves, even if I'm not there. If we have paces or a goal for the session, going faster than the goal pace isn't necessarily a good workout. It isn't something that is rewarded or celebrated too much. It's more like, well, that one was too fast. Let's slow it down on the next one. And that's what I'm trying to find the sweet spot of that. It's a never ending process, but trying to find that way of operating that allows people to find consistency, that they grow their own self-confidence, by lifting each other up, and it has built on year by year. Again, we're fortunate to have an athlete like Mario have some initial success, and then other athletes came and saw how he did things and how we did things, and that was able to grow from there. And so when Vincent joined, for sure he benefited from seeing how Mario did things, the way that he operated, and the others, and that's enabled also to contribute back to athletes like Mario, or on the women's side with Katie or others, where their training mates have also helped them. So but within the whole context of our environment, we try to find that we work hard, we push each other, but without it feeling competitive. I think the success of a group is that each individual finds what they need from the group, and then together as a whole, we're better.
That's phenomenal. Even just what you said at the end there, I love that. And it was kind of, when I spoke to both Mario and Vincent, both of them described how there was a real awareness in the group that I don't need to push because I know the best in the world is right next to me, that this is the best in the world right here. So I don't need to go beyond that. There was this they all felt somewhat comfortable, if they're doing a run workout or a swim or bike, they didn't need to try and do a bravado one off the front in any discipline, because they're like, hang on, I know I'm already with the best in the world. This is the level. I'm at the level. If I can just be amongst it, I'm going to be comfortable. And I remember Vincent said, when I crossed the line at the San Grand Final of the IT World Series and won the World Series last year, he said, look, I was asking him how he truly felt. And he said, actually, I felt bad at first. I didn't know, Mario had finished in front of him in that race, but then, finished second in the World Series. And he was kind of explaining the fact that Mario had, let him come into the team, or you and Mario, I guess, had made a conscious decision to let Vincent into the squad, and he kind of felt bad. Well, here he was, nobody's won 4 in a row World Series, I guess, and Mario had won 3 in a row, and he felt kind of bad. And he said he went up to Mario and sort of said right at the finishing line and said, I'm sorry, mate, and Mario just said, mate, go and enjoy it. You deserve it, and it was this. He said, it was a release that I needed to actually go and enjoy it. I couldn't enjoy it until I had the permission almost from Mario. And I think creating that kind of that bonding that you guys have within the group is something that, yes, you're getting performances now, but I think it's going to live with all of you for forever. It's like these strong bonds where you all want the very, very best for each other, and that's what makes the group so powerful. So just congrats to everything you're doing on that, mate. It's absolutely brilliant, because I know it's not easy. I know the personalities of professional triathletes. I mean, you've worked with some big personalities in the sport, and I know it's not easy. So I congratulate you on that. And what I want to do is I'd actually just like to wind the clock back a little bit and ask you, when did you sort of find your passion for endurance sports? And, I think, you're an athlete in your early days and then transitioning to coach. So tell me a little bit about that background.
Yeah, I think it comes from, my father was a cyclist, just a recreational cyclist, but I got involved when I was young in the cycling club, and the cycling club held a triathlon, and so I did that without particularly training on it. I would have been 11 or 12. And then that kind of led into the Kids of Steel triathlon series in Ontario in Canada. And, I started competing, 13, 14 age group, and moving up from there. Eventually raced Junior Worlds in Cleveland in 1996. I wasn't a great level, but certainly appreciative of the opportunities in the sport at the early stages, before there was like high standards for selection and funding and all of this. If that had been in place when I was doing it, I probably wouldn't be talking to you now. So, and then I got hooked up with Barry Shepley, a famous voice of the ITU and coach at the time, and his club in Ontario, and that kind of opened the door a bit to high performance. I could see that my career wasn't going to go too far. As I say, it wasn't a great level, but one thing led to another, and I started traveling around to races a bit wider than Ontario and some international races, and eventually ended up in Victoria in British Columbia, where our paths first crossed just after Simon Whitfield had won in Sydney. And that was really the start of understanding what real coaching and proper coaching would be, being on deck. And I was fortunate enough to be given an opportunity as, I guess, an apprentice coach at the time. And that was really the start. And I guess it was a case of taking the opportunities as they came. I didn't necessarily set out to have a grand plan of how I would move into coaching and different levels of coaching, but took the move across Canada to Victoria, which is quite a long way from Ontario. I drove across the country to really immerse myself in that post Sydney Olympics environment with Simon and Peter Reid was out there. It was and is a great triathlon community, and that's where I learned a lot more about high performance and the opportunities that came after.
It was funny. I do remember that. I was obviously with Simon leading into the 2000 Olympics, and that whole time in Victoria, Canada, and the explosion of him winning the Olympic gold in Canada for Canada. Sorry, it really was it kind of stimulated the whole triathlon world, if you like, for Victoria, Canada, especially where Simon was based, and my wife Laura and I were based, and I remember you and I went to dinner several times during that, the little sushi place, wasn't it? Remember that sushi boat place we went to several times, and you were a young guy, but you were so passionate and curious and wanting to learn more, and I think you were like a sponge and somebody that I think just grew with the sport, and like you said, took the opportunities as they came. But it was it's been great to just watch your process, and I guess my next sort of question is, you've got to this point where you are now over this last 20 years, and who would you say that have been your sort of biggest influences for your coaching style? For me, when I look back, it's kind of like Arthur Lydiard, and then I did some work with Brett Sutton and Emil Zatopek type work. But is there anybody that's influenced you more than others for the way you're coaching?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we're a young sport. We don't necessarily or haven't had sort of the older, wiser triathlon coaches. There have been a few, but it's not like swimming or athletics, as you say. And when I reflect on that, I reflect on the relationships that I've had with the athletes and learning from the athletes. Simon and working with Simon and yourself in that environment in Victoria had a huge influence, and lasting to this day, of how do you work with athletes who have a lot of experience, who have a history of success, and I think it necessitates approaching it like a partnership, and not always of equals. It could be a case of the athlete has much more experience, but can we find a way to work together to add value together, and that's been influential, through all my coaching pathway is that understanding. And it was, as I said, grateful to have that opportunity. I didn't plan to, and I probably didn't even recognize it so much at the time, but it was what we had to do in order to find a way forward. And that concept of, as a partnership, it's not a situation as a coach where I'm dictating the plan and the athlete must follow it and there's an authority structure and such. It's much more, we agree to work together. We think there's some ways to add value here and to improve, and we're going to be part of that process, every step of the way together. And that's different for every athlete, how exactly that looks. but still, that's the way that I look at those relationships, and as a real partnership, and as one where there's ownership on both sides, and all through the steps. That's how I've thought about it, and so those influences from the early days have carried with me, and in terms of the training, that's changed over time. I think I've been, I reflect on all the different kind of experience. Again, what have I done with athletes at work? What mistakes did I make? Often it's the mistakes and the bad decisions that I made that are the best way to learn. But having observed other athletes and worked with a number of athletes over time, I think it feels like each opportunity to learn and work with an athlete specifically to what they need and what are the demands of the sport, of the what level are they at. That's been a layer on layer of learning, and so it's not so much just from a coaching model or training model. I suppose the ones that I have identified with to some degree, perhaps Lydiard, as you said. I appreciate that way of thinking, and but I've tried to find my own way based on the experience with all the different athletes over time. From working there in Canada to my time in Great Britain, and the athletes that were on the rise then, and to now. I think I've developed sort of a model, that's a way of thinking. While it's slightly different for every individual, like the training model, if you like, has definitely evolved over time. I did think the other day, what have I taken with me in terms of training practice from those days? I think that's changed a lot in terms of how do we do the training? What is the training model? The way of working is more what I've taken from that time. The way of working with people, the way I think about high performance. But the actual training, that's evolved a lot over time, and been able to refine that, year after year. Even now, I think we repeat a lot of the same things every year, a lot of the same kind of workouts, the same kind of build up. I tried to find the subtleties of how we can continue to evolve. And it's that evolution over time, I think, that's I've been able to refine to try to apply to different individuals and try to find success with that.
It's funny, when you're looking at your training and consistency that you mentioned, but the sustainability of that, and then trying to adapt as you go. It's like, just as you find a great routine and something that's really working out wonderfully, everybody's a year older, a year more experienced, or need to adapt to different environments or different competition, or you got to step up to another level, and you got to keep reinventing yourself. And that's the exciting thing, but also the tricky thing about coaching and being an athlete. It's kind of, how do you try and always stay one step in front? And, with the learning that you've had, whether it be preparing Simon Whitfield, who was a well-established athlete by the time you picked him up, still a young guy, but fairly well-established and knew what he kind of wanted. I think you were probably dealing with a fairly strong personality at times, and having to manage that and both sort of work together in that marriage before the 2008 Olympics, where, he had that phenomenal race to come second to Jan Frodeno, and then going into that British program, that, with the 2012 Olympics being home in London for the Brownlee brothers and everything else. And I'm not sure to what degree or how much you're involved with all of that, but I know I think you were the head coach during that time. So there's a lot of big personalities just in that window, where you're having to probably step back sometimes and learn how to work with these. It's different than a coach working with an 18-year-old kid and then working with them for 10 to 15 years and building with them. You've put yourself into some environments where these guys are already rock stars in our little world of triathlon, and you've come on and had to mold yourself and give to them, but also sort of learn how they're operating. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's certainly working with Simon was challenging. I mean, as the former Olympic champion and all the success that he had and influence in the program, I had to adapt, the right style to try to get the most out of him and that environment, and that's changed. When I was in working as the head coach of British Triathlon, it wasn't a direct coaching role, which was pretty different. but still had to work with challenging people, whether that be Alistair or Helen Jenkins, or any athletes that are successful are challenging in their own ways. And I know sometimes it's easy to sort of grumble about difficult athletes, but I think that's the job. That is high performance. High performing people are not always easy to manage and work with. And finding a way to work with different people and get the most out of them is I think what you want as a coach. I think what's the goal in coaching is to get the most out of every athlete that you have the opportunity to work with, or every person. And so while there's a common perhaps worldview, a common model of thinking, it's still about the individual, and it's about getting the most out of that. And so I think that's where those formational relationships in the start, where I had to adapt my style, has served me well. And again, a bit lucky that those were the opportunities I had to grow. But I think also my personality is towards that direction anyway. I'm not somebody that needs to dominate or be the center of attention, and that's probably helped in some of those situations where I was able to be in the background, happy to be in the background. Obviously, the athlete is the one that goes out and performs and responsible for the vast majority of the success they have. And I certainly recognize that, and I see the job as is primarily the support structure in the background to help them optimize themselves to go out and express the work that they've done.
Yeah, it's not an easy role, this coaching role, and we often laugh about it. I think Pete Coulson put it best. He was married to McKeely Jones, former world champion and silver medalist at the Sydney Olympics, and he said the coaching role is basically when the athlete does well, it was all because the athlete did such great work. I mean, the athlete does poorly, it's always the coach's fault. So it's like you never get the true pats on the back. I mean, I think you're getting some now with some success that you've had, but it's a tricky little position, and it's certainly not a role for anybody that has a large ego, because you don't. If you go into coaching for the pats on the back and the ego side of things, you're not going to be rewarded. It's not a place for that. It does take a certain personality that's prepared to just be there and want to support the athletes hit their performances and take great joy from that. It's I think even the athletes that I've coached, whether it be my wife Laura or a number of others, I've actually found it almost more joyous to see them be successful than it was a lot of my own success. There is something very gratifying about helping others achieve their goals and their targets and everything else. And I want to move on to a little bit and just the team that you've created at within the Joel Filliol crew. You've built a pretty strong team. Just tell me about the people that are helping keep this all together and help the athletes reaching where they want to get to.
Yeah, it's evolved over time. I mean, it started off basically just me, but I was looking at how do we grow, and what is the scope to make this like a more professional operation, and but without having necessarily resources of a federation. So basically, how it works is it's a private squad. So we perhaps receive some funding via some of the athletes depending on their level, but essentially we don't have a budget to work with. And I could see what Darren Smith was doing at the time, before me, but I was observing what he was doing, and he sought a physio or a therapist that could work with the athletes, and considering the model of that we were moving around in different places, and the fundamental principle is keep the athletes healthy so they can continue to train consistently and therefore go and perform. How could we invest in therapy as a way to have some insurance about that? So we tried a couple of different people, and the challenge was always who could commit to the lifestyle of living in hotels and traveling around. And it's not for everybody. It's difficult. And eventually we came across a Spanish fellow called Jose Miota, Pepe to us, and he's been with us for the last several years, say about 5-6 years, and he's been following the path with the athletes and with me through that time, and that kind of partnership, I think, has been instrumental to success. He's both a therapist, but also ends up, there's always a psychological component to therapy, talking about how they're doing, and as they're on the treatment bed, and then he and I talk and try to anticipate the decisions we'll need to make. I think fundamentally to success, to be consistent and successful performance is our making good decisions every day. And in a squad of athletes on any given day, there are a number of decisions we have to make, and usually it's about how fatigued are they? Do we need to change from what we had planned? And so working and talking with Pepe every day in training camp, we could try to make better decisions, and avoid problems, avoid injury problems as they come up. So Pepe has been a big part of that process. Later on, we've had some different assistant coaches, and I thought, how do I grow our capacity to have enough individual approach, and an Australian called Drew Box, who was an athlete first with the squad, and eventually decided he wanted to move into coaching, and it was the perfect opportunity to take on an apprentice. And he's added a huge value over the last years as well in our staff, if you like, and in supporting the athletes. And he, like every coach, they bring their own perspective, and a young coach brings their, particularly one who was in the squad brings their own perspective, and that's helped continue to make good decisions, continue to have success. So, the three of us have been part of the squad the last years, and forming that support network. And since the Rio cycle, so after the Rio Olympics, I also took the post with the Italian Triathlon Federation, and I say that's my primary job now is the performance director for the Italian Federation. And that came about talking with the president of the Italian Federation about bringing sort of the best in the world to Italian athletes, and that was his idea, and creating a synergy there, and that support on both sides, both from helping me create a structure around the athletes, and incorporating some Italian athletes directly and also indirectly, has been a big part of that underpinning success as well. It gives us a kind of stability, and also gives us access to other support. I can work with young Italian coaches, and that's been important also to underpin not only the success of the Italian athletes, but the environment we have. So both of those things together have grown over time, and certainly in the last 4 years. So from the Rio Olympics to now, that's been part of how we've been able to find the success we've found.
It's a really great mutual beneficial relationship, that one. Just a quick mini break before we get back to the show. I just want to remind you guys to go check out athleticgreens.com/Greg. Sign up and get your free 20 daily travel packets with your first order of $79 added value. That's athleticgreens.com/Greg. Largely what this show is about is, for me, in my own experience, it was always to learn and surround yourself with the very, very best. So the president of the Italian Federation has done a great job to say, look, here are my athletes. Now, where are the best athletes in the world? Oh, they're in the one squad. Let's bring over that head coach. And for you, it's worked because you get that stability that you guys needed, and the support structure that you want. So that's a really interesting sort of way to go. And I think it's very clever. When I hear things like that, I'm always like, great, people are really forward thinking, and it's very well put in place. I just want to move on to probably what a lot of the listeners are really craving to hear a bit more about and that is your overall training structure. And for me, I've been just so impressed, so amazed how consistent your athletes have been since 2012, really, since you've had your own squad. And the consistency at the top level not just year in, year out, but through each season, from the first race often in Abu Dhabi in March all the way through to the grand final often in September, and the ability to keep showing up in both the men's and women's racing, and the very few injuries or illnesses that I ever hear coming out, of your team. And that fascinates me for a sport in which we tend to be on the knife's edge the entire time. And we're basically one step from a niggle or an injury that's going to take us out for a couple of months. But you've been able to manage not just one athlete, but a multitude of athletes for so many years. And so what is it that you guys are doing that's allowing you guys to perform at such a high level consistently?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has changed is the series, as you referenced. So now that the ITU World Champion is crowned basically the winner of the series, that's now the demand. You have to be good from the first race to the last race, and so we set out to figure out how to do that. And one concept that's resonated over time, that I probably come to a little bit afterwards, but then look backwards and say, yeah, I think that's probably what we were trying to do is find the minimum effective dose of training. So and when I first think to myself, when I hear myself say that minimum, I think, well, that doesn't sound very high performance. It doesn't sound what you need to win. But what is the level of training workload that the athletes can sustain that it enables them to be consistent and that gets the performance we want? And how that's evolved over time probably is less focus on kind of race pace and race specific work, and I think more emphasis on the foundational work, the meat and potatoes endurance work that's not very exciting, it's not very fast, but I think it's foundational to having success through the season. In fact, needing to revisit that through the season. So I think that the early models of triathlon as I knew it, we would prepare for the first race and start, as we got closer to the first race, we would want to do specific training to be prepared. And then we would sort of stay in that mode of specific training as we go from race to race. And I found it seemed to wear a lot of athletes down. They reach the end of the season and be sort of gasping, on whatever fitness they had left. And so how I've changed that over time is, first of all, the specific periods, race pace work, runs off the bike, threshold training are a lot shorter than I used to do. And even probably have refined that, making it shorter and shorter every year. And the more general training, which it doesn't mean easy, but under threshold type work, that is a greater percentage of, I think, the training model, and then revisiting that through the season. So, I mean, if we don't decide necessarily, of course, what the calendar of races to do is, I mean, that's one of the changes the last 8 to 10 years is the demands of the series means it's hard to race a lot of other races. So, when the World Series is announced, that's pretty much the schedule of races we're going to do without anything else typically. And so we've got to find ways to build in sort of retraining into that season. So revisiting the basic work. I think primarily the driver of that, I think, is that race pace work and race intensity work, race preparation work is kind of toxic, meaning too much is not sustainable. Too much makes you sick in a way, or not able to continue to progress. And it's like figuring, what's the minimum amount that we can do that will get us ready to race? And where does that race fitness come from? And I often notice this, I mean, I'm aware of it every year, the first time we decide we're going to run off the bike. And we see the speeds the guys are able to hit in the first runoff. So we've not trained this, just coming from their run training, is already faster than they need to go in a race, in any race. And so again, I kind of come back to, well, what are we training there? Well, we're certainly expressing something and good for the confidence. And some athletes might need a little bit more than that than others, as an example of specific training. But we've trained that through our other phases that they're able to do that. So, and the other phases are more sustainable. They're, we are not and when we're talking about minimal effective dose, I mean, not only just the intensity, but it's like, well, what's the sweet spot for our model of training? And I kind of think we're in the middle. We're not extreme volume. It's not 35, 40 hours a week. But it's not 15 or 20. It's, that 25 to 30 hours a week. Can we do that consistently and build the foundation for the year? And also the part that's connected to this is training in a sustainable way in that minimal effective dose model, if you like, means that we don't work so close to the razor's edge that we need to take a lot of planned rest within that training model. So we don't follow, a traditional periodization in the sense of, 1, 2, 3 weeks of building progressively and then 1 week recovery. It's more monotonous in a way. It's every week is a gradual progression, but subtly over the last, and we just continue like that through the winter or through the main training period. So it's I guess pulling down the peak, making it more sustainable, and really managing how much race specific work it is, acknowledging the stress that puts on the system can affect them over the sustainability of that over the long term, and figure out what's the right amount, and not being sort of macho or egotistical about doing more just because we want to be the best, we want to compete with the very best, but we know that the best aren't the ones that necessarily train the most or train the hardest. Okay, well, what does it mean to be smart then? Well, then it comes back to this model, I think, that I've arrived at through trial and error, and coming back to where we started is, well, what do we reinforce in that training environment? And in this model, we don't reinforce or emphasize, going faster all the time. We emphasize or talk about doing the right amount or the right intensity for the individual. What's the right speed we're going to run for a session, and let's run to that speed and not faster. And I think in that way we've been able to find some consistency. It's something that takes time to build up to. When I first start to work with a new athlete, I often find that at the beginning, they might find, oh, this is kind of easy, I can do this. And then, week 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, now it's a lot harder. And some have taken a lot longer to build the capacity to manage that. But eventually, when they were able to manage that, then we find that consistency. And, an athlete that comes to mind is a young Australian called Jake Birtwistle, who joined us after the Rio Games, a bit perhaps the next year after that. And the first year he was able to do most of the work, but we had to build in a little bit more recovery. Not a huge amount, but a little bit more. He's a bit younger than some of the other guys, and we could see, though, year on year, his ability to manage that level of program has grown a huge amount, and to the point where last year he was the only male to win 2 World Series, and has been on the podium of the overall World Series, as well as being a younger guy without the same history as the others. And illustrate that as an example of, we had to get it right at first. There's no point in him just pushing through doing training that he wasn't yet able to absorb and yet able to recover from, but eventually found, I think, the strength to adapt and to get into that flow, that rhythm of what we're talking about. What's the minimum dose for each individual that gets them ready to perform? So it's taken time. It's a trial and error. It's slightly different for every athlete, but it's still the same kind of model, the same way of thinking, the same way of working. And it's one that I reflect a lot about and tweak here and there. And, it's one that I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to think, well, now I've got it all figured out and, I can just reapply this, because of course that doesn't work in sport. But it's like, I also don't want to change too much. And I've been that place before where I've felt like, well, we're doing the same thing. I really should change things up. And I've made mistakes before where I've made too many changes. So I think the last years have been about refinement of that model and refinement for each individual, and probably growing confidence in doing a bit less. And it's a hard thing in the current environment of social media, of Strava, of everybody knowing everybody else's training. I mean, we never had to deal with that, in years ago, that we never didn't. You kind of knew what some people were doing, but not really. And then over time, as we've learned more and more, it creates a kind of paranoia, or somebody coined, and I picked this up, this Stravanoia. What are other people doing in like mega training, super hard, super fast, and and I think that's a challenge for sort of the modern athlete now, is how do you filter that out? How do you not lose confidence in your process and what's right for you? Because again, it's so easy just for an athlete to go off and do too much, and they're superheroes for a couple of weeks, and then they're broken or they're exhausted or injured, and we don't want that. We know those are the kind of things we want to avoid. But so we're a bit fortunate that we've been able to build this model, and because we've been able to demonstrate success with other athletes following this model in this environment, it's sort of easier to onboard other athletes to that, because they see, hey, look, this works. It's maybe less than I used to do. In the case of Vincent, previously he was running a lot of Ks, and so some of the training that he was doing was half his previous running volume, for example, and maybe a bit more focus on the bike and a bit more recovery. And it took him some time, as it would any athlete, to kind of find their confidence in that model. And ultimately, they got to go out and prove it to themselves. But we do have that sort of built-in advantage of having had success with others, and they see that, they follow, and eventually they've got to see it for themselves. But that's kind of where it's coming from. We're searching for that consistency. We're searching for that sustainability. We're trying to do the right amount, but not more. And it's like it's not a fixed thing. It's a mental model of thinking. It's not like there's an exact amount of intensity or volume, because no two situations are exactly the same. That they move the dates, they move races, the timing, the place. But we try to apply that in the same way. And I think for that reason, kind of filtering out, some of what's going on in the rest of the world, and focusing on what's the next step in front of this athlete, what's the right amount for them that moves them forward, so that they arrive at races with bullets to fire. I think I like this analogy of, there's no use arriving at a race and you already fired all your bullets in training, meaning, too many sessions where you went to the well, or too many sessions where you tried to prove something to yourself in search of confidence. And, I know many athletes that have had incredible performances in training that we don't see in races. And that's the antithesis of what we're trying to do. We're trying to save our amazing performances for racing, and model the training in a way so that they're arriving at races ready to fire.
And touching on that, that's exactly what you're doing with the team culture that I've talked about with the squad environment. And when I look back at my career, and it was, when I came out of squads, I think sometimes I'd become a very good trainer, and I wasn't adapted to racing. I kind of, like you said, I'd fired all my bullets. And it wasn't until I kind of started coaching myself and Laura, and we started doing a lot of homework. And we both touched on, Arthur Lydiard. I read so much of his type of work. I trained under Brett Sutton. I had some concept and ideas from him and Emil Zatopek. But it was really this coming along with the concept that speed kills. You need to do it every now and then, but in my mind, it was speed kills. And you touched on briefly, when we're talking about these athletes, these elite athletes running a 10K in 29 minutes to 30-minute window, okay, for these guys to run a 255K to 3-minute K pace, to do one of them is not hard at all. They could do that any time of year pretty much. It's not that hard. the key is to figure out, how do I do it 10 times back to back, having a little bit of fatigue in the body from the swim and bike as well. And that's when I remember sitting down with Laura and just going, look, it's not about running faster. I need to try and just get fitter. I need to be so aerobically fit that I can sprint the 10K and not worry about failing. And that's where I started incorporating, the 2-hour long run every week, whether I was racing or not racing, for years. I didn't change it, just the 2 hour. And I do that at what we termed, Laura and I termed, best easy pace. And so it wasn't slow. Some days it might be, but generally speaking, it would be up to around that sort of 3-minute 40 to 3-minute 45 type K pace. And I remember that if I could get to that point aerobically to some degree, and now look, I wasn't wearing heart rate monitors, and maybe it was even too fast at times. And I did get injured, so I'm sure it was too fast at times. But the idea behind it was to just build this aerobic engine so I wouldn't falter. And it wasn't about the speed. I knew that I may not be the quickest guy over the first 500 or K out of transition, but I'll own them by the end of the 10K. And that was the way we trained our swim, bike, and run. And that sounds to me very much like what you guys are doing. I think when I look back at mine, I did still too much speed, and a lot of that was training on my own and thinking I had to do more, and lacking that confidence in myself, which again, like you're saying with your athletes, it kind of grows the more you kind of do this work. But I've got to laugh when I just last week had Sebastian Kinley on the podcast, and we were both laughing how the amount of data and information we get from all these other athletes on social media. And we're both scratching our heads going, well, how did we win races when we know they were producing far, far better numbers than us anyway, whether that be VO2 max, whether it be watts on the bike or speed they're doing on a treadmill or their track workouts. It's like, how are we even competitive with these guys? And it's like you said, they do it one-off and they show this one-off workout. They don't have that consistent, frequent type training model that just gets them very, very, very fit and sustainable throughout the whole year. Just a fascinating, 15 minutes you gave me there. And I'm going to have to go back and replay it for myself because you've just got so much information there. When it comes to the aerobic versus intensity kind of model and looking at a week, are you prepared to tell me sort of what a week would look like and how much running and biking and swimming, or how many intense workouts you would do for each of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, connecting those dots, what you said, I think success in triathlon, despite the changes in the sport, is still primarily about the fittest, the strongest, and the freshest. And I don't think it's changed that much in that way. Even down to Super League, we've had athletes win a lot of Super League races off of, without a real specific training for that. And it comes down to that, aerobic fitness, strength, resistance to fatigue. Being fast only matters if you get to the sprint and you're still in the game. So, and that's the hurdle that the vast majority, they never get to the sprint. They got blown off well before that. So, our model is one that you would see in a lot of places around the world where we typically run main sessions twice a week, the Tuesday and Saturday main sessions. It's something that it's a staple here in the UK. It's a staple in a lot of places. There's nothing special about that. We might run more longer duration type of reps on a Saturday and shorter, faster stuff on a Tuesday, typically. That could progress from just strides to longer stuff. So typically for our running, everything just progresses over time, step by step. There's nothing particularly interesting about that kind of progression. It's somewhat arbitrary, but just slightly more volume of work as the weeks go by. So, one of the, when I reflect on different athletes, it's how fast you can go or the quality you can go under fatigue kind of tells us, I think, more like how you're going to race. So when under the chronic load, that gets higher. That's where you start to see the differences. And of course, what we try to avoid as coaches is pushing too hard before they're ready. But, so that twice a week model of main run sessions, and the cycling typically follows that as well. 2 main cycle focus sessions per week. And of course, the frequency of all of the other days fills that in. That I wouldn't say that the success comes from the particular kinds of sessions uh, or necessarily what we're doing on those sessions, but the progression over time I think is important. We leave somewhere to grow. We don't do our biggest workouts at the beginning of the year and then just try to sustain that. We just gradually add a layer on another layer on another layer. And then the swimming, we typically as well do 2 hard sessions a week, and that could be Tuesday and Friday. And so that model of 2 main sessions where there's some more quality is how we go through the year. In the winter, maybe it's 1 session or slightly smaller sessions. Or a different focus, hills instead of paceline work on the bike. A change of focus, but we tried to control that intensity. And then we swim 6 days a week. We've done various things in terms of volume over the years, but I think try to find a sweet spot of main sessions and volume. So that can be between 25 and 30 Ks a week in the pool. The hours on the bike can be as few as 8 to as high as 16, depending on the time of year and what we're doing. And then the running, I tend to think in Ks for the running. It can be as few as 50 to 60 K for some that are more prone to problems with higher volume, to 100 to 110. Not typically much more than that. One thing that's changed over the last maybe 6 years is the type of bike courses we have in racing. Have put a bit more demand on the bike, so we've had to adapt a little bit of the training to that. And the type of cycle training and the focus on the bike. I like to think of the number of corners, that the technical nature of the bike has changed, in increasing the demand. So we've adapted that. So I think we're at the middle of the road in terms of volume and how and the type of sessions we're doing. I think there's nothing particularly special about that. It's more about how we manage the decisions along the way for each individual within that concept.
And are you doing a long run? I mean, the Saturday and Tuesday, do you do longer runs over an hour, or what are the kind of miles that they're doing for that?
Yeah, but I like what we've evolved to over time. Is the Saturday run session is also a long run, so we will have it could be an hour 30 to an hour 45, pushing 2 hours, depending on the session and where we are. But it includes a session during that, so it could be a tempo run, a build run, it could be a workout and a long run as part of one. And then we add volume via double runs for certain athletes, and so it could be easily a 30 to 35K day on a Saturday, depending on where we're at and the individual athlete. Again, it's not a rule for everybody, but certainly the ones that can handle a bit more. And then we might have double runs other days, a Tuesday or Thursday double run as a safer way to increase volume or to have a bit higher volume and frequency wise. And again, that depends on the athlete. I think the right run program has got to be individually what they can sustain and what they can sustain, with health. We want to avoid bone problems. We want to avoid other injury problems that are just so easy to do with running with these guys that can be so centrally fit. So it takes time to build that up. But so it's a middle of the road, I think, and I'm thinking, again, what's sustainable, what's right for the individual, what's the minimum dose, but we're pushing the stress for them to adapt.
And so the big one when it comes to this, especially the World Series type racing, is the tapering and getting them ready to really fire that bullet, like you said. How have you implemented? Do you look at each athlete differently, or do you have a kind of a set idea of how you like to taper in for these races?
Yeah, there's a standard model. We typically follow a very similar type of race week with the exact same kind of prep sessions that has a structure, but also without holding to a particular standard. We try to avoid the athletes getting worried whether their race pace sessions are faster or slower, kind of as they're finally prepping into the race. But a standard structure, and of course it depends on travel, depends where you're coming from. The going to Hamburg is slightly different than going to Yokohama or whatever in terms of the race week. But it typically is just the race week, and the weekend before could be a little different. And I guess what we try to do is make that predictable, so it's almost the same for every race. Not necessarily because, okay, now we're at the grand final. There's other reasons why the final or, another race will be a peak performance, if you like. But I think that consistency, the predictability of following the same kind of plan prior to most races that we do, I think it gives them a familiarity that's comforting when they go to race week. Okay, we're going to do this. And it's not exactly the same, but we have slightly different, the last run session that we have 2 or 3 variations that we'll do. But over time, they know what they are and they know how to do them in a way that is good for their confidence and is connected for them to preparing for the race. So yeah, as I said, it's primarily what we do the weekend before and the race week. So that will be different prior to when we're ready to race. And the other angle to that is, well, how long was the training block before that? If the training block was a very long one, maybe we back it up a little bit before. If it's shorter, then primarily race week. But I tend to think in terms of, how do we get the athletes able to have a predictable performance and connect that familiarity to their racing performance. And in that way, it's fairly similar to every race. It's not the idea of let's peak once a year, but let's be good every time we race, and we follow this pattern before we race.
And it's a matter of tapering enough, but also maintaining that fitness that you want to maintain to go to the next race. And that's always the fine line. I mean, you obviously get a lot of fitness out of a race with that very high intense workout. I think it's another way to sort of boost that fitness to another level. But I mean, that's why Laura and I, we would often, call sort of that March, April type races as pre-season. We'd go in with little taper because we just wanted to just get a hit out and see where things were, just so we could manage the program going forward. Do you guys do that kind of a thing? Would you look at any early season races, or because Abu Dhabi's in March, it's just we got to be fit for training, just go?
The last years, the last 6-7 years, Abu Dhabi's been pretty much the first race, and we want to be good, and usually there isn't other options, so we haven't raced before. And over time, I guess we've grown in confidence to be able to do that, to go right from the off season to going very fast and be, feeling confident to be able to be in a position to contend for the podium and win those races. So I think that's been part of this formula, but I guess it comes back to, having confidence in your process and demonstrating to yourself and through your training mates and the environment that you can have success in that way. So that was an evolution, I think, of previously having done a number of small races to prior to important races, to incorporating that into training, but just enough, not too much.
It's interesting. You seem like a coach that is very observant and very can kind of see what each athlete needs, and you've taken the science of coaching and it's turned it more into an art of coaching. And that's, I think, what separates you from probably many of the other coaches out there. I had Christian Blumenfeld on, the Norwegian athlete that won the grand final this year, and his coach Aruld, and their squad. There's 3 of them: Gustav Eden, Christian Blumenfeld, and Casper Stone. That are doing very, very well with the Norwegian squad. Now, they seem to me to be one end of the spectrum in terms of data and science and lab testing. And do you do much of that, or are you kind of shifted away from that and prefer just to be observant? Or how much sort of heart rate work and testing are you doing?
Yeah, we're on the other end of the spectrum of that. The other end of the spectrum, meaning we do none, no testing, no lactate, no formal like performance benchmarking in training. I like to think that the only relevant measure of performance testing is the race itself, and of course you are subject to, if things can go wrong, if you get a puncture, then you don't find out. But you come back to being confident confident in your process. And I didn't start out that way, though. I started out, back in, when I think of those days in Victoria, I had a lactate pro meter. I was experimenting with all different things, and I'm interested in sports science. But I think I've developed a better filter for what I think could be interesting in theory to what actually works in practice, or what is my experience to make it work in practice. And, being better at saying no to things that could be interesting, but, could have unintended consequences or unintended side effects. And the sports science industry has exploded with all different ways you can enhance your performance. And there's a lot of validity to these things in isolation, but it's figuring out, what can you actually incorporate? Because the risk is you try to do something that perhaps you don't quite understand, or is new, or that has negative side effects that could often affect the psychology of the athletes. And it's one of the things that I learned with a few athletes like Simon or Alistair was not particularly like performance testing or lab testing. And so if you've got an athlete that doesn't benefit from that or doesn't gain from that, then better figure out a way to do your process without that, because you could just end up worse off, than you started. And the other part that I always ask myself is, having this information or having more information, how is it going to help me make better decisions? What am I going to do differently if I learn this information? And sometimes it could be something, but often what you think you might learn and the reality of what you're actually going to do differently don't line up. So I've tried to be a filter with this and simplify our approach. And I suppose it's also been by necessity, because if you don't have a lot of resources, if you don't have a physiologist or a budget to buy all these toys, then you can't do them. So you better find a way to be successful without that. And I think endurance sport at its core is simple. I think some of these things are a great way to add value and add something, but you don't necessarily need them. And that's kind of the ethos that I've built up over time out of necessity. I like to look at the commonalities, though, of success in endurance sport. And, the Norwegians are on one side in terms of testing, but they do a lot of hours, they work hard, they do a lot of sub-threshold work. And when I look at them and other athletes, of what I can learn from them, and perhaps that's perhaps where the success is coming from, and not necessarily because of all the other things that they're doing or others doing. Not to say that there isn't something to learn there. I think we need an open mind in terms of approach, and you don't want to be closed off and think you've got it all figured out. But at the same time, it's like, well, what is essential here? What if we boil down what different athletes are doing? What are the commonalities? And how do we apply that to our context? How do I apply that to my guys? What can I do, or what should I not do? And we've experimented with some different things. Like, one of the things was swimming power meters. This is a new thing. These accelerometers that are accessible and in every device now. Everybody's got an accelerometer now. And it's like, well, how can we apply this to swimming? And we went through a phase of trying to figure that out, trying to learn, and invested a lot of time and energy. In the end, not sure if it made a difference, or if it was a dead end. And but it cost time and energy to go down that road. And in another context, something else comes along. I'll consider that kind of experience of what is the opportunity cost of doing something, doing some study, doing some experiment. And I tend to think that the stuff that's really effective will filter through to a wider population, like power meters. At the beginning, they were not so common. Only the $3,000 plus SRM, and now everybody's got a power meter. And so I tend not to worry about missing out on some of those things, because I figure, somebody else is going to figure out if it works or not, and I'm going to watch what they're doing, and then if I think it's valuable, I'll adopt it. So, endurance sport is simple. I think, despite the desire to complexify what we do, at the core of it is pretty simple. And there are some things, technology, that can help us do a better process, but I think you don't need a lot of a lot of toys to do good endurance training.
I love that. Endurance sport is simple. One of the things that we've kind of said is, this whole big thing about marginal gains, or it's the 1%, the 1%. I'm like, well, hang on. I think we've got so focused on the 1% that we're missing the 99%. We're missing the consistent, frequent, solid work, and that aerobic conditioning that you're talking about, without so much intensity, because that's where the toxins come in the body. That's where we get injured, illness, and all those things come from. And we need to be really careful with that. And but it really is simple, and you got to be prepared to just do the day in, day out work. And like you said, you're not taking any planned days off specifically, and you're not doing planned weeks in what they used to term a periodized program, which things like 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or anything. You're not doing anything like that. It's just this consistent, stay fit, keep building it gradually over time. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. Are you working with your athletes at all with their mental approach, or do you let them do that themselves?
I like to think that the psychology of training is interwoven in everything that we do and everything that we say. So it's always a part of that. That said, there are time and place for some athletes who need a third party and could benefit from a third party to help them do that. And one of the athletes I think that's talked publicly about that is Katie Zaferes, and she's benefited really tremendously from developing a relationship with somebody to help her manage all the pieces of her sport. And there's other athletes where, that's the messaging, the what's important, what do we need to focus on, how to handle different situations. That's part and parcel of the process every day. So of course, that's something that all coaches need to be aware of and get better at and improve. You could perhaps make an argument that if you want to be a coach in high performance, you should study psychology at least as much, or not, if not more than physiology, right? In the difference makers, the key moments in our sport, in any sport or in any endeavor, are often, they're to do with emotions. They're to do with psychology more than facts. It's not always rational, and figuring out a way to work with people in that context, I think, is essential. So it depends on the individual, depends on the context, but I do think it's not something that we can just offload to somebody else. I think there's a bit of in high performance like this, integrated support teams and, the wider team around the athletes that often come from, Olympic bodies and federations. But the risk of that is it becomes a bit of a tick box exercise. Like, we got a psychologist on staff, tick. But are they really involved in the everyday? And the reality is almost no triathlon program can have that in a daily level to make a real impact. So the coach and the people that are involved have to learn those skills. And some it probably comes easier than others, but it's something that everyone can learn how to be better and more effective, and how to handle the critical moments. I think, again, as a coach, I think that, there's these critical moments, these learning moments, moments of influence that you don't necessarily know when they're going to be, but if you handle them well, you can make a positive impact. And if you handle them badly, it can have all kinds of negative impacts. And those can be right after races. Those can be, when the big goals didn't happen, or there were, things fell apart, or it can be a bad training session. It can be dealing with injury. All those critical moments where your skills to navigate those can make all the difference, and is probably often the difference between finding success and not.
It's a fine balance. I used to say, and this is where athletes are so unique and so different. My wife Laura would have a bad race, and she was able to sort of water off a duck's back almost and just get on with it, and it didn't affect it terribly much. And I used to say to her, I need my time to be disappointed. It meant something and it didn't happen, and I put a lot into that. And I used to put a timestamp on it, though. I'd be like, look, I need 2 hours right after the race. I'm happy to have a happy face as I cross the line for all my family and friends. I think, they mirror you. So if you cross the line all disappointed and pissed off, then they are going to try and pump you up, and it almost makes you feel worse. So I always found the best way to cross the line, no matter what happened, have a smile on your face and just be like, oh, it wasn't my day. But I'd often go back to the hotel room and I'd say to Laura, look, I need a couple of hours to be just pissed off. And I'd write down some notes or whatever it was. My point is with all of that is how unique and how different each athlete is, and how as a coach, you've got to kind of massage that gently for each person, and helping them deal with their emotions and their mental state is almost like you just got to take them one at a time. But I always put a timestamp on my disappointment, because I didn't want it to drag over any longer than it needed to be. I think it was the discipline to allow yourself to be disappointed to a point, and then like, okay, move on. Next step, what do we do? That's how I had to approach it, whereas I think Laura was a little bit more easygoing about it. She'd still be pissed off, but I don't think it affected her quite as deeply as it did to me. And you mentioned, you almost need to be a psychologist more than a physiologist. And I laugh at that, because my wife, Laura, has done a lot of nutritional work in numerous clients. And I'm always telling you, it's more psychology than it is nutrition working with these people, because it's, most of our behavior comes in the form of either we're depressed or we're happy or we're sad or whatever, and that affects everything else that we do in our life. And on that, are you doing much with your athletes with nutrition?
Again, it depends. It depends on the athlete. Some have some great resources around them, and it's like recognizing where being a generalist, like a coach like myself, what's the limits to our knowledge, and what can we implement, and then where do we need to get help. And it could be for example, around eating issues for some women or men in some cases, how they see nutrition connected to their body image, to performance, to their confidence. That can be an area where having a third party can make a really big positive difference. Can mean about some of the stuff that's come up is around the preparation for a hot race like Tokyo. What kind of nutritional interventions could need to be different than normal, and then getting some outside help on that. So that's one where we use the resources of the wider team around the athletes often. It's not something that I've necessarily developed a go-to person myself, but according to the different contexts we have, for each athlete, and it's something where an Olympic federation can have a value by having somebody that's really world class available to the athletes, and often that does spill over from one to the other. So if we get a great piece of advice from one Olympic committee, that might spill over into some of the other athletes. But that's how I've seen it. It's like, well, what resources do we have access to? Keeping an open mind, and how do we solve individual problems? So always open to kind of learning from other experts and trying to figure out what can I implement myself, or what's better off left to somebody with a deeper domain knowledge, and maybe perhaps compartmentalized from the everyday environment. And that's again where it's different. It's different for different athletes, and according to their needs. Obviously, it's important though in endurance sport. We've got to fuel ourselves for performance, for success. There are performance issues around body composition in different directions. Can you produce enough power on the bike? Do you have enough energy balance to be able to sprint and keep enough muscle mass through otherwise a very catabolic process of endurance training? For some, that's been the issue as the sport's evolved and become higher demand on the bike. And often it's keeping energy balance so that you can do the training you want to do and recover. So again, what stops our athletes from being consistent, from doing the training, it can be nutritional issues. So it's important, and it's context dependent.
And it's a difficult one. You don't want to get too involved. It's a real struggle with some of the athletes, because you don't want to overstep either. It's kind of like, I'll stay in my lane to some degree. I mean, unless if you had an athlete that turned up on pool deck and was exhausted every day and you thought it was a nutritional issue, then would you point them in the right direction to somebody?
Yeah, I mean, the That's actually not an uncommon one. Is athletes that are not fueling themselves enough, and that's where we've got to try to identify it. But one of the things we see is when an athlete loses the ability to change pace, and they got like one speed and they're just kind of dragging. It's certainly worth asking questions. What's going on? Are you eating enough? Are you getting enough carbs? Are you getting different sources of carbs? Or we certainly had athletes who had got some ideas maybe that we didn't know about, maybe they've changed their nutrition, make their composition of what they're eating. They've gone to a low carb diet and not said anything, and then it's had a kind of a short term impact. That kind of thing. Again, it's the wider world and the explosion of social media and experts and accessibility has a positive and a negative side. And do see it come up a bit on the nutrition side and psychology, where athletes can have different ideas from different places that maybe are not compatible or that have unintended consequences that we could discover via an indirect way that they've gone down that road. Or if an athlete wants to become a vegetarian for all different reasons, like, well, how do we manage that? And maybe getting some help in that way, and having that outsource can be the best way to deal with it.
Fantastic, mate. Is there any sort of gear recommendations you can give? And I guess the other question I had for you, are you coaching any age group amateur athletes at the moment, or is it all focused on the elites?
Yeah, my business is really narrowed to only really elite, and primarily, although I did a lot of work in Ironman for some years, it's really now Olympic focused athletes. I like to think it's the type of thinking could be applicable to any discipline, but it's really narrowed down. And the basics in terms of what it's nice to have if you use it in the right way. Of course, standard stuff like a watch that does GPS that we can get uploads, and a power meter is nice to have. A working power meter, because it seemed like in any given week, 10% of the power meters are without batteries or some problem. But again, I like to keep it simple and accessible, and now those kind of devices, they're ubiquitous. Everybody has access to that. And, I think it's like communication is the technology that we tend to use, whether, the amount of text messaging, WhatsApp type thing. And now the absence of being able to see athletes from time for longer periods of time, then, using video a bit more than we might have otherwise has been useful, just to see the athletes and be able to talk has been of value. When I think again, what's the success going to come from here? It's being able to communicate, it's being able to understand each other, and all the data that we can have is part of doing that. But the basics, doing the fundamentals well, is understanding where the athlete's at and what they need to do moving forward.
Are your athletes using smart trainers and things like that at the moment? Are they on the different platforms, Be Cool, Zwift, or any of those things? Or are you guys going for group rides together just somewhere on that?
Yeah, there's been like informal meetups, or they organize it themselves, but absolutely. This has been really interesting to see the explosion of the smart trainers, and how much more interesting and more effective that is than the devices of the past. I used to have a CompuTrainer back in the day, and now I've got a fancy smart trainer just so I can understand as well. And I think it's really interesting. I think coming out of this quarantine kind of lockdown thing, where we've been forced to do some different things, and you see the efficiency. I was never a fan of the kind of the pain cave, the indoor kind of work, although I understood for practical reasons why a lot of working people go that road, or depending where you live, for a safety point of view on the bike. But we're certainly seeing the effectiveness of this kind of environment for your training. Can be really powerful, can be really useful. So yeah, maybe we take some of that stuff going forward. But those are, any of those platforms you mentioned with a smart trainer certainly make indoor training so much more interesting and effective than years ago, and is a real benefit, I think.
I can't wait to get one myself. I'm still using a trainer from about 15 years ago that just in the corner of the garage, very old school, 12 5-minuters, big gear, don't overthink it, and that's about it. And it's kind of like I'm watching all these things on the social media, and I'm like, actually, this kind of looks like a little bit more fun than what I'm used to. Like it's not even a pain cave. It's a corner of the garage. So it's really just very dark and dingy. What about you guys travel so much. Is there any kind of, for people listening, that places they should go check out for training that you've just loved and you highly recommend?
Yeah, in Europe, the winter staple for a lot of athletes are the Canary Islands. There are different training resorts on various islands: Lanzarote, Fuerteventura, Gran Canaria, Tenerife. They all have sport resorts. They all have hills and wind and pretty consistent warm weather in the winter. So we've gravitated towards down there, where we know on the continent, while the weather can be all right, it can still get pretty cold depending on the year, where down in the Canary Islands, it's very predictable. You very rarely get change in weather that impacts the training, and it's not so far away. Inside Europe, we've spent a lot of time on the island of Mallorca. And there's a huge cycling culture there, and so we've appreciated that. There's various resorts. One of them we had a connection to called Viva Hotels. Viva Blue has got their own hotel, and there's a number of these. But we've gone back there many times. So the pool being on site to where you stay makes everything easier, because your commute is minutes walking instead of getting in the car, and just the efficiency of a training holiday or a training camp is hard to beat. So we spent a lot of time in Mallorca, and then also over in Girona, north of Barcelona, in Banyoles. That area of Catalonia is great for training. Really quiet roads, a lot of hills, and some nice pools and lakes. And so we've spent a lot of time there in those regions, and you can also get into the Pyrenees from there to some of the altitude training. So there are other places. I mean, over time, that familiarity has been really valuable. But I'm always keen to look out for how we might mix it up in the future, whether that be St. Moritz in Switzerland. Have been a number of times. Livigno near St. Moritz on the Italian side is also quite good, and they've just built a track up there. And we've also spent time in Flagstaff and in Tucson in Arizona. Not as much the last years because there just hasn't been the races, but always appreciate going up to Flagstaff. The great variety of running trails. It's incredible up there. And Tucson some years ago, but for the weather. And in Boulder, I guess that's probably where you're at. It's an endurance mecca, really. And I've appreciated being there, but I haven't done as many training camps there. More visiting individual athletes and appreciating the lifestyle there.
Mate, that's fantastic. All of those spots, I can see people just jotting them all down and going, right, here's our next racecation location. And I did spend some time in Mallorca a couple of years ago, and I was never there as an athlete. I was just coaching an athlete there a couple of years ago and spent a few weeks. I was just blown away by the amount of people on bikes. I've never seen an economy that's basically driven by cycling. That's what, if you go to Mallorca, you're there to ride bikes. It was just thousands of people on the road, and the cycling was just extraordinary. But a lot of those places you've mentioned, I've spent a little bit of time, but I wish I'd spent a little bit more time when I was an athlete. But mate, the amount of athletes that have come to me for coaching or advice, I've sent your way, believe it or not. I kind of say, look, there's one squad that you got to be a part of, and one coach you got to be with, and that's yourself and the Joel Filliol crew that you're with. I have a young niece, Kemper Reback, who's mad about the sport, and I just keep telling her, look, you got to reach out to this guy. And I don't care if you got to be an apprentice, carry bags, do whatever it takes. But if you want to make it, this is the guy that you got to be a part of. So I really appreciate you coming on and spending this time and just dropping so many so much knowledge, just so much great stuff, but it's also simple, as you said. It's like it's complicated yet simple at the same time, because it's just basically turn up and don't overdo it and just keep it consistent. Just some great messages in there, and I really appreciate you coming on. And thanks everybody for listening. This has been absolutely fantastic episode. If you're enjoying the show, I'd love you to subscribe or share it and give me any feedback you can. But mate, stay on the line, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for so much, Greg. I really enjoyed catching up with you.
Cheers, mate. Thanks everybody.
Thanks a lot for listening to Be With Champions. If you enjoyed the show, your support would truly be appreciated. You can visit the Be With Champions Patreon page, or you can subscribe with your podcast app of choice. Don't miss the next episode, so subscribe and be notified. For show notes, if you want to know more, please visit bennettendurance.com. I'm Phil Liggett, and on behalf of Greg Bennett, here's to the next time, and I hope you will join Greg again very soon.